Hey guys, this is Footer Strain. In a previous video, I talked a little bit about how to create a gradient on a flat object like a knife. In this video, I want to continue my conversation about how to create gradients on a shiny object, but this time I'm going to do a bottle. This is sort of the bigger brother to the bottle that I'm going to use on set today, but I just wanted to use it to show you sort of how shiny the label is. This particular label is basically a mirror wrapped around the bottle, and if you're not very careful with how you light it, you'll get a lot of very bright highlights and a lot of very harsh shadows throughout the label. So I've learned quite a few things to kind of get around how to light this label and make it look its absolute best. So let me take you through how I do everything. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to talk a little bit about how I've got everything set up right now. I'm using two of my diffusion panels, one on either side of the bottle, and on the outside of each of the diffusion panels, I've got a large strip box right here. If by chance you don't have a strip box, another option is you can use a set of barn doors. If you get two of these guys, you can kind of shape them into a elongated rectangle, move everything a little bit closer, and it works essentially the same. This would probably work fine for this smaller bottle that I'm shooting, but for larger bottles like shampoo and conditioner and things like that, it's not quite big enough and it doesn't give you much wiggle room to work around the larger bottle. One of the things with these really shiny bottles that you're going to end up doing is creating an entire tint around the bottle itself so that you don't have any unwanted reflections at all in the scene. So eventually I'm going to end up putting a diffusion panel right in front of the camera that has a hole in it that the lens can poke through. So that gives you three options for how you're going to shoot the bottle itself. Option one is to shoot straight on to the label. What's going to happen when you do that is you're going to have a black line that just shoots right through the center of the label. That can be okay, you can retouch that out, but when you've got something that's this text heavy, it's really quite a pain to retouch around all of this text. I've done it countless times because of the composition of the photograph that I needed to shoot it straight on, but it's not the funnest thing to do in the world. The other options are you can shoot just below or just above the label and shoot down or up on the label. In a previous video I did several years ago, actually, I did an on white where I'm shooting from below the label and up onto the bottle itself. But in this particular shot, I've decided I want to shoot above and into the label this time, just to show you some of the problems that are inherent with that. So I've talked a little bit about the setup as it is right now. I haven't really adjusted anything. I've just got the strip boxes in place, the background light in place. I haven't really messed with it at all. But let's look at what the image looks like right now without any other corrections or adjustments. Okay, as you can see, it's pretty rough. First off, I'm going to mention that the label is starting to peel off, so we'll deal with that in a little bit. Another thing, you'll notice the gigantic black line that's probably a 1/4 inch wide that goes through the very center of it. That's this open gap where there's no diffusion panel right now. Like I said, if I put one with a hole in it and I shot straight on to the label, I'll get a small skinny black line that goes to the center of it, which is not ideal, but it's doable. This right here is not even doable. You can't really deal with this. So you're going to have to put some type of diffusion material or some type of white card in front to get a little bit more light into the center of the label. One of the things I decided I was going to do was do a little bit of a reflection off of a piece of black plexiglass, which is what I've got below. We're going to talk a little bit about problems to contend with that right there, but before I get into that, I want to just do a sample shot where I just take the diffusion panel off the one side and we just see what it looks like without any diffusion panel at all. So let's do that real quick. So real quick, I just dialed it down about 1.5 stops just so that it wouldn't blast the whole scene. And let's see what that looks like. So now you can see what it looks like without a diffusion panel at all. It's just a strip of white light and then black on either side of it, and it goes really quickly. I would definitely say that the other side that still has the diffusion panel is a lot more pleasant, but let's see if we can work on what we've got. We'll put the diffusion panel back and we'll kind of play with it a little bit more on that one side, on this side right here. Okay, so the diffusion panel is back to where it needs to be. Just so you know, this is what I'm going to hang the diffusion panel in the center off of here in a minute. I've just got that in place for later. So one of the things that you can do is you can vary the gradation, how quickly and how slowly it gradiates away by moving the light closer or further away from the diffusion panel. So again, this is what it looks like right now with just the diffusion panel back to where it was. So if you look at that, you can tell that there's a fairly straight line in the front of the bottle. That's probably this edge right here at the edge of the diffusion panel. And then it gradiates a little bit smoother to the back. If we move the light a little bit closer to the scene, what's going to happen is it's going to more quickly gradiate out. So it's going to be a little bit of a sharper cut off for the light. You can kind of cut the difference, and it's one of the things I really like to do is you put one side of the strip box close to the diffusion panel, and you put the other side of the strip box, you just sort of move it away from it. So it creates a sharp line on one side and then it gradiates in one singular direction. I feel like this kind of creates a nice little motion of light towards a particular direction, especially with these bottles. A lot of times what I like to do is I create a gradiated light on the back edge and I gradiate towards the front. And I'd like to do something similar to that. I just don't want to move it all the way back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the back edge of the strip box close to the diffusion panel. And then I'm going to move the front edge away. So that creates a little V shape at the top. Let's go ahead and put a diffusion panel in the front so that we can kind of get a little bit better idea of what the light looks like without that distracting black line in the front, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, that looks a lot more pleasant. We don't have that distraction of the black line in front of everything. There is another black line on part of it. That's this other side. There's a bit of a gap over here. We'll fill in that gap with some extra diffusion material here in a little bit, so we won't worry about that right now. Let's work on getting this light. Again, what my goal is to create a sharp line on one side that gradiates very gingerly off towards the front of the camera. What I would like to do is start the gradient right about where the logo is, maybe a little bit further back where the proceed with caution portion is, and I'm just going to move it around until I get a nice straight edge on one side and I gradiate in a very ginger fashion towards the front. So I've made a few adjustments that I talked about a little bit, but I want to kind of talk about them individually in turn. I did add some diffusion material in the corners right here to get rid of the black lines that were on the sort of side fronts where these two panels meet. I've also added another one on the other side as well. I moved the back diffusion box up a little bit to create a little bit nicer light back there. It's creating a nice highlight towards the back and gradiating towards the front a little bit there. I tamped down this label a little bit while I was at it. I've got this at a pretty angular to my diffusion panel itself to create that gradiated light going forward. The other light isn't quite as angular, and that's something you'll have to do with each individual bottle and what you're working with is just kind of play around with how much of an angle. It may be more or less than this angle. I know that if I have this all the way back and I'm creating just a light on the back edge, it's not nearly as much of an angle as this, which is probably, say, 6 to 8 inches or so of an angle straight on from the diffusion panel. I think it looks really quite nice. I like the way that the label itself is lit. I like the way that the cap is lit. There's a few problems that I want to talk about with this. I'm basically threading a needle with this particular label. If you notice that on the label on the top silver portion, you can see a black dot. That black dot is the hole where the lens is poking through the diffusion panel on the front. If you look at the very bottom where it has a little bit of instructions on the very bottom gray strip, you'll notice another black line that's going through the text. That is the piece of plexiglass reflecting from the bottom up into the label and back at me. So I'm basically threading between those two spots so I've got as little to retouch out as possible. And I think I've got it in a pretty decent spot. I don't have to retouch it out of the entire label. I don't have to retouch it out of the proceed with caution portion of the label. And what I end up having to retouch out is a little bit of black on that top one and a little bit of black in that in the biotin word at the very bottom label. The other bigger problem is that there's a big black line that goes through the center of the label in the reflection in the plexiglass. There's not much I can do about that with this particular angle, but that's the reflection of the whole of the lens at that particular angle. I would just have to go through and retouch all that out. Yes, it's going to be a pain. Yes, it's time consuming, but it is doable, and at least I'm not having to retouch that black line out of the entirety of the label as if I was shooting directly onto the label itself. This kind of leads us into a little bit more of a discussion of things that I had to do to kind of with the plexiglass to make sure that it wasn't reflected unwantedly into the label itself. So let me take you a little bit closer to the set, and I'll talk a little bit about the plexiglass and things that I've done to adjust for that as well. Like I said, I want to talk a little bit about the tabletop surface itself and when you're shooting on that, and how to avoid getting unwanted reflection of the tabletop surface into your shiny label. If you notice, the shot that I shot was on a long skinny piece of plexiglass like this. It helps to put it up on a piece of riser like this so that you can take as much advantage of the diffusion panels on the side and not interfere with the tabletop surface you're actually shooting on top of. But if you can get it as skinny as possible, what you'll do is you'll avoid getting unwanted reflections of the width of the tabletop surface in the bottom edge of the label. If I shoot on this 1 foot square piece, it's a nice graded light on the top portion of it, but as you go down, you start getting the tabletop surface, this large piece of black plexi, interfering with the reflection on the bottom edge. You can blend it a little bit depending on the situation, and you can make it look okay, but it's a lot easier if you can avoid it altogether by putting it on a smaller, skinnier piece like this. And if it really comes down to it, you can cut an even skinnier piece that's very tiny and just big enough to fit your label or your bottle onto to avoid it entirely altogether. So I was trying to make this as quick of a hit on how to create a gradient on a bottle like this as I possibly could. But just in case, if you've got any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything like that, please put a question in the comments below. I'm more than happy to answer anything that I can answer. Just to kind of recap everything, I just wanted to kind of, once again, kind of go over the things to think about when you're doing something like this. You've really got two options. You can shoot from just above the label or just below the label. If you're creating a reflection like I was with a piece of plexiglass, you've got to thread the needle a little bit between the top of the label and not creating a line there and the bottom of the label and not creating any lines on the bottom of the label. You may have to do some retouching here and there, but you're trying to keep it at least a manageable level as much as possible. The other thing to think about is the overall width of your tabletop surface and trying to reduce it as much as you need to avoid any reflection of the tabletop surface itself in the bottom edge of the label. Again, so that you don't have to fix too much in post, although again, it is doable, it's just a bit of a pain. The other thing you've got to think about is just the relationship between the strip box and the diffusion panel and kind of creating a nice angle so that it creates a nice gradiated line with one sharp line on one side and gradiates evenly away from it. You can shoot with the strip box straight on through the diffusion panel and kind of have it gradiate evenly in both directions. That's fine too, and you can really play around with it and shoot different kind of feels and styles for different types of bottles depending on what you're shooting. That basically wraps everything up for this particular video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye.